Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Armpit Intellectuals, the podcast where highbrow ideas meet the humor of everyday life. Wow. I'm Zara, your co host, who brings the research and occasional serious tone.
And I'm Bilal, your other co host, here to keep things lively and possibly throw in a bad joke or two. Armpit Intellectuals is all about blending the lofty with the ludicrous.
Ludicrous. Today we've got a fascinating figure to discuss.
Like the rapper.
Exactly. But we're not discussing the rapper. We've got another fascinating figure to discuss. Someone who's been called an outlier and intellectual bomb thrower, an urbane, Oxford-educated polemicist. We're talking about Tariq Ali. If you've never heard of him, don't worry. We've got you covered with background, juicy stories, and also, I hope, a sharp analysis in equal measure.
Tariq Ali, the man, the myth, Wait, is he the guy who inspired a Beatles song or something?
Close. Actually, John Lennon's Power to the People was inspired by an interview Lennon gave to Tariq Ali. And rumor has it that Tariq Ali was allegedly the inspiration for the Rolling Stones street fighting man. So, yeah, he's the real deal. A bona fide 1960s icon of activism who's still kicking in the 2020s. Can you believe?
Impressive. तो फिर कहाँ से शुरू करें? The guy's life is like a cross-continental epic.
शुरू से ही शुरू करते हैं भाई. Tariq Ali was born in 1943 in Lahore, which was then part of British India. And he comes from a quite politically active family, leftist family. His parents were journalists and activists under British colonial rule and later in Pakistan. So I guess it's safe to say you could say that, yeah, activism is in his blood, in his lineage, his virasat.
Right out of the womb with a protest sign, I imagine.
Really? Practically, though. In his teens, Tariq Ali was already speaking out against Pakistan's military dictatorship, which, started in the late 1950s and early 60s. That, of course, didn't sit well with the authorities. In fact, an uncle in the military intelligence warned Tariq's parents that their son's activism would get him into serious trouble.
Mm-hmm.
So that was when his parents sent him to England for safety and education.
Yeah. I mean, they thought that, sending a rebel to Oxford would calm him down. But I don't think it did.
Definitely not. Tariq Ali studied philosophy, politics, and economics at Oxford, the famous PPE program. PPE, and immediately threw himself. I think Riz Ahmed studied the same thing, but I could be wrong. And immediately threw himself into political debates there. Or actually, sorry, it could have been Mehdi Hassan. It's one of those. Anyway.
Mehdi Hassan is more probable.
Probably, yeah, more likely, yeah. But I know they both went to Eton College. So, which is this very elite.
Yeah, I don't care.
Boys' school. Okay. He joined the Oxford University Humanist group and found those debates far more stimulating than the stuffy confines of the official Labour Club on campus. And by 1965, he became president of the Oxford Union. Wow. Which is a big student position known for hosting high-profile debates.
Yeah, for sure. So he would be the MUN going kid, but on steroids after joining Oxford, right?
Exactly. That is so 2011 A-levels in Pakistan. It is the exact same thing. Yeah. And around that time, he was rubbing shoulders as well with some historical figures, historical. And in December 1964, Malcolm X visited Oxford and met with Tariq Ali after debate. And Malcolm X even expressed fears that he might be assassinated. So, yeah, can you imagine? Tragically, Malcolm X was killed just a couple of months later, and that encounter left a deep impression on the young activist Tariq Ali.
Wow, that's a front row seat to history. And I guess it didn't stop there. He was friends with folks like John Lennon, all right?
Yeah, he was friends with cultural icons and fellow radicals. By the late 60s, John Lennon and Yoko Ono were in his circle. Fun fact, Tariq Ali and activist Robin Blackburn interviewed Lennon and Yoko Ono in 1971, which was an interview so influential that it helped inspire Lennon's song Power to the People, as we mentioned previously. So Tariq wasn't just like politicking, he was mingling with the counterculture royalty of the era.
Wow. I bet those parties were wild. Oxford debates by day, rock and roll by night.
Possibly, yeah. But Tariq Ali wasn't just in it for the social scene, right? Like he was deeply involved in the new left movement, as it's called, of the 1960s. And he became a prominent voice against the Vietnam War. In London, he famously debated heavyweight figures like US diplomat Henry Kissinger on Vietnam. And so did Iqbal Ahmed,
Yeah, for sure.
which, we discussed in our very first episode of Armpit Intellectuals, which
Yeah.
was about Iqbal Ahmed. So give that a listen if you're interested. Tariq Ali even testified at the Russell Tribunal. Tribunal. Yeah, we're doing an episode after a few months, so we're still like getting back into the groove of things. So this testifying against at the Russell Tribunal, that was a public hearing which was set up by activists to examine U.S. war crimes in Vietnam.
So he's in his 20s, taking on Henry Kissinger in debates and testifying about war crimes. Talk about fearlessness.
Yeah, definitely. He also organized protests. So, Tariq was one of the first name basis was what? He was one of the protest leaders who marched on the US Embassy in London in 1968 to oppose the Vietnam War. So picture the late 60s. We have student uprisings, anti-war marches, and Tariq Ali was right in the middle of it, especially in Europe. And in 1968, he was in Paris during the student revolts and, other spots of global protest, which he later actually wrote about in his memoir.
Yeah. I mean, it seems kind of similar to what's happening right now, but not exactly, because all the movements are being cracked down by, I don't know, all the authorities or say right-wing governments. I mean, that's what happened later that time too, when it died down. But
because it's like techno surveillance now.
techno surveillance, yeah.
Is much like, now there's surveillance cameras. They didn't have this stuff in that time.
I guess, yeah, that's true.
So surveillance definitely increased with technology.
For sure. Although that memoir's title cracks me up, Street Fighting Years. Sounds like a punk band album.
Yeah, it does definitely have some kind of punkish tone to it. And it's his autobiography, which he wrote in the 60s, I believe. And it is appropriately named because it chronicles those turbulent years where he went from Paris to Prague to Hanoi to Bolivia, crossing paths with people like Malcolm X, philosopher Bertrand Russell, actually, wow. Actor Marlon Brando, also wow. And even the Rolling Stone, Mick Jagger. Random, but my mom actually sat next to Mick Jagger on a plane once.
Okay.
I met him in a bar or something like that.
Okay, cool.
At a hotel mein wo baitha tha.
Cool.
So, it really dawned that my mom is like Tariq Ali, but I was saying, it really captures the energy of global protest movements in the 60s.
Yeah, that's incredible. It's like Forrest Gump, but the radical left version. He's everywhere history is happening.
Kind of, yeah. But unlike Forrest Gump, Tariq had a lot to say about what he witnessed. So let's talk about one of his defining traits, which is, of course, anti-imperialism. So from early on, Tariq Ali was a vocal critic of empire and war. He was growing up in the shadow of British colonialism, which gave him that perspective, and the Vietnam War solidified it, right? Over the decades, he's consistently spoken against what he sees as American and Western imperial adventures, whether it was Vietnam in the 60s, NATO, Natu interventions in the 90s, or the Iraq War in the 2000s.
He really doesn't hold back. Didn't he famously oppose the Iraq War and even call out Tony Blair?
Oh, absolutely. He was a key figure in the massive anti-Iraq war protests in London, which took place on February 15th, 2003. And that global protest, which was historical, and millions marched worldwide. Tariq Ali was one of the speakers addressing the crowds that day. And while the protest was, kind of coming together, energizing, he later reflected on its outcome with, his trademark candor.
Mm.
At the 10th anniversary of those protests, he said, I didn't quite tell them Blair is going to go to war regardless of today, but I knew that it was a huge show of anger. But that's about it. It left no lasting legacy, in my opinion. Which was pretty blunt, He's basically saying one protest, however large, wasn't enough to stop the war machine.
Yeah, harsh truth there. I guess I remember that time a little bit. I mean, I was, what, 9 years, I guess?
I guess it was post 9/11.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
yeah,
of
of course,
course.
Saddam Hussein and all
Yeah,
that, of course. Yeah, it was actually quite.
yeah. And yeah, a lot of people were disillusioned, but the war went ahead even despite all the opposition, I guess.
Yeah, and I feel like, Tariq Ali has a way of mixing hope with realism, right? Like he's often the one reminding movements that a single march won't topple a policy, but persistent action might, right? So more than protesting, right? Like what can you do? Like, you know?
Yeah.
And he's continued to emphasize grassroots activism. In one interview, actually, discussing global justice movements, he said, we need grassroots mobilization. Sorry, I'm really not trying to talk like it's just coming out. Global justice movements have to link up with the anti-war movement. He really believes in people power, right? Even if he's seen its setbacks.
So that means activism is a huge part of his life. But he's not just a protest guy, he's a writer too. Let's get into his writings because I think you mentioned he's authored a ton of books.
Indeed. Tariq Ali is definitely a prolific writer and just prolific overall, I think. He's written nonfiction and fiction. And on the nonfiction side, he's covered history and politics from many different angles. For instance, one of his earliest books was Pakistan, Military Rule or People's Power, published in 1970. And later he wrote Can Pakistan Survive? The Death of a State in 1983. Quite ominous, but you can tell he's tackling the tough questions about his birth country's future, right? And then right after September 11 attacks, he wrote The Clash of Fundamentalisms, Crusades, Jihads, and Modernity, which I actually have a copy of. He wrote that in 2002, putting those events in a broader historical context. And then he followed up with Bush in Babylon, a 2003 published, which used essays and even poetry to criticize the Iraq War. And further than that, he's dissected U.S. politics with books like The Obama Syndrome, Surrender at Home, War Abroad, published in 2010, critiquing the disappointments of the Obama era. Of course, there were many. And in 2015, he published In the Extreme Center, A Warning, which in which he critiques the centrist politics in Britain and beyond that, according to him, which of course served the old elite interests. The same old.
The man does not mince words. Extreme center. I like that. Sounds like a wrestling move or something.
Yeah,
But is it actually a political critique?
Well, yeah, he argues that mainstream parties, whether they're labeled left or right, they often kind of, meet on pro-establishment neoliberal policies. So he says that the quote-unquote extreme center, like he uses that as kind of an ironic term, I guess.
Okay. Speaking of neoliberal, he's also been critical of economics, right? I think I read he's no fan of neoliberal capitalism.
Correct. Tariq Ali has remained a staunch critic of neoliberal economics and globalization, which honestly, respect. For example, he was at the 2005, I believe, World Social Forum in Brazil, and he signed the, I don't know how to say this, Porto Alegre Manifesto. Okay, I'm sorry. Within my research, I did not learn the pronunciation of this, but it was in Brazil, and it's obviously Brazilian Portuguese. So anyway, this manifesto was all about alternatives to global corporate power. And he often praises movements like the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela. which was essentially left-wing projects that pushed back against US-led neoliberal policies.
So he's kind of cheerleading for socialist experiments in Latin America and such.
In a way, yeah, he is. In fact, he even collaborated with the filmmaker Oliver Stone on this documentary called South of the Border, which came out in 2009. And it was about the left-wing shift in Latin America. And he co-wrote that documentary, which profiles leaders like Hugo Chavez, Evo Morales, and others. And I believe he called it a quote-unquote political road movie. And one striking thing he said about it and about Latin America was that these changes that are taking place are not coming about through armed struggle. All these changes have come about through democratic elections. He was highlighting how, unlike the eras of Che Guevara's guerrillas, the new Latin American left was gaining power via ballots, not bullets.
That's a hopeful twist. Revolutions at the ballot box. And it shows Tariq Ali is not just stuck in the past. He adapts his thinking to new trends.
Definitely. And aside from his heavy political nonfiction, he also, as mentioned, writes fiction, specifically historical novels. I just love highlighting this. I think it's fascinating that he's written fiction as well. And his most famous fictional work is a series called the Islam Quintet. Which is 5 novels that explore encounters between Islamic and Western civilizations across history. So he wrote in 1992 Shadows of the Pomegranate Tree, which is set in Moorish Spain after the fall of Granada, examining the lives of Muslims, Christians, and Jews as the Spanish Inquisition looms. In 1998, he wrote the Book of Saladin, which imagines the life of the Muslim leader Saladin and the Crusades from a Muslim perspective. In 2005, he wrote A Sultan in Palermo, dives into the medieval Sicily where Muslim, Christian, and Jewish cultures intersect. That's another in the quintet. And 2010, he wrote Night of the Golden Butterfly, which brings the story to modern times, even touching upon contemporary London and Lahore. And each of these novels tries to retell history from the other side, right? Like highlighting, the very rich, complex histories of Muslim societies. It's really quite a unique contribution, which, counters the usual sort of Eurocentric historical fiction about places like Italy and Spain and, kind of erases or, invisibilizes the Muslim history in Europe.
So by day he's writing fiery op-eds and by night he's penning historical epics. I'm starting to suspect that there are 2 Tariq Alis. How else can one person produce so much?
Yeah, I mean, maybe he doesn't sleep. Or he's, fueled by righteous anger and endless cups of tea. Who knows?
Maybe he's on crack. Oh, never mind. You have coffee. Coffee, I guess. It's for closers, tea is for revolutionaries, huh?
Could be. I mean, his output is indeed astonishing. And we're not done, okay? Because he's also a filmmaker and frequent media commentator. I mean, honestly, I'm jealous, to be honest. So, let's touch on his media presence. He has been a familiar voice in British media for decades. He is a long-standing editor of the New Left Review, which is a journal that's been at the forefront of leftist thought since the 60s. I mean, it's kafi mashhoor, honestly. And he's written for The Guardian, London Review of Books, you name it. If there's a major world event, chances are that he has commented on it in print or on TV. I mean, we've seen his YouTube.
I recall him seeing, on BBC's Question Time or Hard Talk. Occasionally giving, a run for their, interviewers a run for their money.
Yeah, people really value his input.
Yeah, exactly.
And yeah, he's done a lot of other interviews. He isn't shy about taking controversial stances, on the issue of, Brexit. He actually argued from a left-wing perspective in favor of Britain leaving the EU, which is wild. Not because he agreed with the right-wing anti-immigrant rhetoric, of course, but because he loads EU neoliberal policies, right? I mean, look at what's happening in Germany these days. And he was sympathetic, right, to a leave vote on left-wing grounds, while, simultaneously criticizing the right-wing anti-immigrant rationale for Brexit. And of course, it's a nuanced position. A lot of people didn't take to it, especially in mainstream circles. But, I think that's just who Tariq Ali is.
Mhm.
He just values principle over popularity. That's why he's such a
Prolific figure. Yeah, he truly can please all, it seems. You can't actually. Which, funny enough, is the title of his last memoir, right?
Was it?
Yeah, his new memoir, You Can't Please All.
Yeah, You Can't Please All. That was actually published in 2024. You're right. It covers his life from 1980 to 2024, essentially picking up where his 1960s memoir Street Fighting Years left off. And yeah, I think the memoir, discusses the Cold War's end, or it starts from there to the rise of neoliberal globalization, 9/11, war on terror, up to what's currently happening or what was happening up to 2024. And, he discussed the Soviet Union's collapse, his friendship with Hugo Chavez of Venezuela. And, he even discussed cultural subjects, actually, like cricket in post-colonial societies.
Interesting.
So it's broad, and it shows, how he's been an eyewitness to history, right? Like, he's 80, man.
Yeah.
That is, wow. He wrote this book looking back on his lifetime of activism and writing with a critical eye.
Yeah, what a life. And I love the memoir title, You Can't Please All. It's like he's embracing being a bit of a rebel who's fine with ruffling feathers. I mean, when the Observer newspaper calls you an intellectual bomb thrower, as we noted, you wear that badge proudly.
Yeah, he certainly does. He's always been an iconoclast, I would say. Like in one Guardian interview, they talked about how he's navigated periods of political defeat by asking, what do you do in a period of defeat? And he's answered that by continuing to write and speak, never giving up on the possibility of change. Like hope is a form of discipline, right?
Yeah.
And he's really embodied that.
Yeah. So can we talk about a bit about his style and personality? Because I've seen some of his talks. He can be pretty sharp and witty.
Yeah, so Tariq Ali's style combines dry wit with erudition. He's formal in the sense that he's extremely well read, right? He quotes history, literature, tossing in anecdotes about meeting world figures. But he's also conversational and often humorous in debates. Actually, he once joked about the British ruling class that, even made like his opponents kind of like smirk, like, they also laughed. And when he gives speeches, he might reference a bit of poetry or a historical quote, which drives his point home. So I guess I would say that's kind of his style. Like I remember Talk, for instance, where he was criticizing American foreign policy. And he said, history rarely repeats itself, but its echoes never go away. A line that, he's of course fond of, as am I, as I'm sure many listeners are, like, is
Yeah.
really powerful line. And he'll then link a past empire's kind of, folly to a current event with, a punchy anecdote. And it really keeps the audience engaged. His style, which is, mostly part story, part stand-up, part lecture.
Yeah. Sounds like our kind of guy, right? Blending the intellectual with a pinch of humor. I guess maybe you should invite him to co-host Bit Intellectual for a day. Just imagine Tariq Ali riffing on current events with us.
Yeah, I would definitely love that. Although I suspect he's probably a bit busy, in life.
Yeah.
But that would be great. I wonder if he ever listens to this, Tariq Ali. Sir, you are more than welcome to join us on Armpit Intellectuals for a day.
Please. So we've covered his early media activism, his writings, his media presence. How about his impact or legacy? Why does Tariq Ali matter today?
That's a great question. So Tariq Ali's importance lies really in how he's been this consistent voice on the left globally for, I believe it's been over 5 decades since he's been active, right? And he's also a bridge between generations of activists. Like people who marched in the 60s remember him from those rallies, anti-war rallies. And younger activists, like us, I guess, were youngish. Still might.
Quite young, but in the 60s.
Yeah, we were quite young in the 60s. Younger activists might know him from his essays, right, and his talks, as we do, right? Especially on topics like Palestine
Right.
and even his talks on like Pakistan, right? And yeah, so speaking of Palestine, he's very vocal about Palestine. And he never shies away from criticizing Israeli policies and supporting Palestinian rights. And this consistency gives him credibility, right? He's always been very pro-Palestine. And whether people love him or loathe him, like, where he stands. He's always against empire. And he's always in support in favor of the underdog.
Yeah. I mean, he's also isn't afraid to critique those on his side when he thinks they're wrong, right? Like left-wing leaders or movements.
That is true. He's definitely had disagreements with other leftists as well. For example, within like socialist circles, he was part of debates on how to respond after the fall of the Soviet Union or how European left parties lost their spark. And he's written about these challenges of leftist movements. And he often asks hard questions like, what happens when a revolution fails? Or why did the left lose ground? In a Jacobin interview, actually, he discussed how the late 20th century was a time of quote unquote missed revolutionary opportunities. Is it Jacobin? Jacobin. I think it's Jacobin. Yeah, my bad. So, this time of missed revolutionary opportunities and how Portugal's 1974 revolution or the coup in Chile, like this defeat of movements, how it impacted global politics. And this shows that he's not just cheerleading or supporting and protesting. He's also analyzing.
So I guess he's a bit of a romantic about revolution, but also a realist when I guess it goes wrong.
Well, yeah, he once said revolutionaries aren't infallible, like acknowledging mistakes. But he never stops believing in the possibility of change, right? It's like he has this like undying hope. And I wouldn't say optimism, but like he just never loses hope. He just always believes there will be change, like change will come.
Change will come, yeah. So before we wrap up, any interesting anecdotes, lighter bits about Tariq Ali we haven't touched on?
Let's see. Well, yeah, back in 1967, he went to Bolivia to observe the trial of a French intellectual, Regis Debray, who was caught up with Che Guevara's guerrillas. And the Bolivian authorities suspected Tarek of being a Cuban revolutionary. Can you imagine?
Yeah, probably looks like them.
And he famously said to them, if you torture me all night and I can speak Spanish in the morning, I'll be grateful for the rest of my life.
Wow.
Yeah, that is really funny. That was basically him saying, like, I don't speak Spanish, so, what are you doing?
Yeah, that's one way to handle danger with humor, I guess. Yeah. Gutsy humor at that.
Yeah, that's why humor is essential to life. And also later in his life, again, revelations came out that he had been spied on by British intelligence for decades, since the 60s into the early 2000s. And he responded to that news with this, I'm not surprised attitude. And like, imagine being considered such a thorn in the side that multiple undercover agents track you over 40 years. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
And it just shows like how influential his activism was viewed by those in power. Like they're threatened by Tariq Ali. Like,
Legally, yeah. In one of his interviews, I heard that he was telling a story about a woman who just met him somewhere in the park. I don't know. And she said that she was an ex MI5 officer who was actually listening to him. And she said that I mean, it was more of a story of like how in the perspective of the agent itself, that she was saying that, I basically left the job because I couldn't listen into people's private lives and like
wow.
how deep that we were listening into. So yeah, I mean, like if MI5 tailing you for decades, isn't a badge of honor for an activist. I don't know what is.
Absolutely. And, he took it in stride, the life he chose, and he's still living it vigorously. He doesn't shy away from it. To this day, he writes, he speaks at events, he's often seen at protests. Even if in his older age, he's more of an observer than a participant, but
Right.
he just doesn't, he's never tried to change his views or quieten. He's never tried to shy away from anything. He's just been himself his whole life, and that's really admirable.
Yeah, it is. So to sum up, Tariq Ali is this multifaceted force, a political activist who cut his teeth opposing war and empire. A writer who's penned both fiery polemics and beautiful historical novels. And a media personality who isn't afraid to call out emperors with no clothes. He's also got a sharp wit, which we definitely appreciate here on this podcast.
Yeah, definitely we do. And, his life teaches us about the power of speaking up and the importance of historical perspective. Whether he's recalling meeting Malcolm X in 1964 or analyzing a conflict in 2024, he just, like I said, brings this continuity of principle, right? This not backing down from what he believes in, staying true to his values, his beliefs, his principles.
Mm.
And that's rare, he manages to do it with this mix of intellect, conversational, clarity and cohesion, his humor and deep analysis, right? He does it so brilliantly. And that's the very blend we aim for on this podcast, but obviously
Yeah. I
we're
mean,
not
maybe,
quite at that level yet.
yeah,
Tariq Ali.
maybe that's why we were drawn to cover him, no? And there's a little bit of Tariq Ali inspiration in what we do, minus, the MI5 surveillance sample.
Don't give them any ideas, Bella.
Right. So if we suddenly go off here, you'll know why, folks. Kidding. Before we sign off, let's give our listeners a couple of book recommendations if they want to dive into Tariq Ali's work. For his personal story and the era of rebellion, as I mentioned, Street Fighting Years, it's like traveling through the 60s with a revolutionary tour guide. For understanding his political take on recent history, the clash of fundamentalisms, to get the view of his view on post 9/11, or the duel, Pakistan on the flight path of American power, for US Pakistan insights. And on the fiction side, Shadows of the Pomegranate Tree, if you like historical novels and to challenge, the usual Eurocentric narrative.
Yes, definitely all excellent picks. And also his new memoir, You Can't Please All, for a broad sweep of his life lessons, which are, lead up to the present day. And I think reading Tariq Ali is like getting this crash course in the last 80 years of world politics, told from a dissenter's point of view.
Mm. And with that, I think we have done justice to this intellectual bomb thrower. What a word. It's time to wrap up our discussion.
Especially after hearing all about, what's happened post.
Yeah, India, Pakistan.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for hanging out with us in this journey through Tariq Ali's life and ideas. We hope it was as dynamic and engaging for you as it was for us. We love Tariq Ali. We think he's fantastic. If you'd like to start off somewhere, and you don't want to pick up an entire book, although obviously I would always say pick up a book, you can watch his talks on YouTube. They're great. And we
he did an Oxford Union debate. He was the Oxford Union president, but there are some new debates that he has done as well. So pretty good. Not debates, but I think speeches.
Right. Yeah.
I don't think right now he would want to debate anyone.
Yeah, maybe not. I think after doing it for 60 years of your life, kind of I'm just going to relax now. And even if he doesn't.
I'm just going to talk, you listen, all right?
Yeah, exactly.
Kiddos.
Yeah, he's pretty much established. Now he doesn't need to debate.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just, I enjoyed mixing in the serious history with a few laughs along the way. Thank you for that. And feel free to send us your thoughts or any topics you'd like us to cover in future episodes. We're definitely open to suggestions. And yeah, I mean, we're eager to dive into the next big idea, big personality that's, of course, like relevant to the podcast and like our interests.
Until next time, although next time should this time be a little bit earlier. We know we've been on a bit of a hiatus. So until then, stay curious, stay critical, and keep a sense of humor.
And this is Zara.
And I'm Bilal, signing off from Armpit Intellectuals. Take care and power to the people.